A few weeks ago, I made a video about my favorite YouTube channels, thinking that during this pandemic time when everyone's stuck at home, it might be something that people would be interested in learning about. Having some interesting things to watch while they're social distancing might be something that people would appreciate. And at that point, I mentioned that I would also make a video about my favorite podcasts. Mind you, apparently podcast listening has gone down now that fewer people are commuting to work on a daily basis. And I can say that for me as well, my podcast listening has gone down considerably as a result of a pandemic, but not for the reason of commuting that a lot of other people are having this problem. For me, on a fairly average day when I was feeling relatively healthy, I would get up and go to the gym, and I would listen to a podcast or two while I was at the gym, and then maybe I would have some grocery shopping or errands to run, so I'd have podcasts in my ears while I was doing that. And then when I got home, I'd be doing housework and cleaning and that sort of thing, so I would constantly have a podcast playing, basically from the start of the day to the end of the day. And it was practically a full-time job for me listening to podcasts. However, now that we're in a period of isolation, I can't go to the gym, so I'm missing out on podcast opportunities there. And my kids are home all day, every day, so I'm not spending nearly as much time sort of alone doing house cleaning stuff because the kids are always around. So again, I'm not listening to as many podcasts throughout the day. However, it is something I'm still doing, and maybe you are too, and maybe you want to find out about some good podcasts. So let's get into that. As with my favorite YouTube channel video, once I got started into this one, I realized I have way too many great podcasts that I want to talk about to fit into an actual top 10. So again, as with the YouTube video, I broke it down into my top 10 favorite podcast categories. And within each category, I have typically 2 to 4 podcasts to talk about. Although, once again, for the number one, I've saved a single podcast for the number one slot. So in total, I'm going to be mentioning 25 podcasts. So let's get right into that. Starting at number 10, the category I have here is the fun facts category. I have here a podcast called Stuff You Should Know, which is a very long-running podcast that's been going for years, has hundreds of episodes, and it's just a super chill podcast. The two hosts, Chuck and Josh, are just really relaxed, fun guys, and each podcast, they just cover an interesting topic. They don't devote a lot of time into getting really in-depth into the topic, so each one is a fairly surface view of the issue that they're discussing, but they're still fun to listen to. In the same category here, I have the Cracked podcast, which once again takes just kind of an interesting topic and talks about it for a bit. As with some of my YouTube channels, I just love learning about interesting facts, random things, and feeding my personal endless curiosity. So going into number 9 now, there's the Interviews with Various People category. Here we have a podcast called Beautiful Stories from Anonymous People, where in each episode, the wonderful host, Chris Gethard, a comedian who I was not previously familiar with before I started listening to his podcast, but it turns out he's just an amazing guy, funny guy, and fun to listen to. In each episode, he basically talks to a random person on the phone. A whole bunch of people will call in, they'll basically randomly pick one caller, and he'll have an hour-long conversation with a stranger, just talking about that stranger's life. And we get to voyeuristically sit in and listen in on this person's life and whatever it is they want to talk about. But they remain anonymous during the conversation in order to be able to more freely talk about whatever it is they feel like talking about in a public format. I had listened to every single episode from the very beginning of this podcast's existence until the whole pandemic hit, and then I started to really fall behind and had to sort of give up on the idea of not missing a single podcast. But the other one in this category is the number one most popular podcast in the entire world, which is the Joe Rogan Experience. I don't listen to every episode, and I don't even listen to most episodes. Basically, once every maybe 4 to 6 weeks, I will listen to a Joe Rogan podcast episode when he has a guest that's of particular interest to me. Usually it's the scientists that he has on his podcast that are the ones that I devote the time to listen to. And what's amazing about his podcast is he devotes a good 3 hours often to just having a conversation with whatever guest he has. So they are able to really dive deep into whatever field their guest is specializing in. And so with the scientists, they can really get into some interesting details about the science or astronomy or whatever it is that they happen to be talking about. So that's one that I just kind of dip into every now and then when a guest of interest comes up. Number 8 is a category that's really fallen for me, and that is true crime. I used to be pretty big into the true crime thing, but the more you listen to true crime, I find the more just depressing it is, just seeing how people are to each other and what humans are capable of doing. A lot of the time too, people will be discussing maybe a cold case, a mystery that is unsolved, which is always very satisfying to not have a conclusion, or maybe they're talking about a case where the justice system really failed somebody. And again, the more you dig into the major systems at play in our society, such as the justice system, you see just how extremely corrupt and dysfunctional it is, and it's extremely depressing. So I don't listen to as much true crime as I used to, but one that I used to listen to all the time is called My Favorite Murder. The hosts, Carolyn and Georgia, are just wonderful ladies, very funny. They make listening to true crime tolerable because of their humor and their compassion. With this podcast, they release 2 episodes a week, and what I used to do was listen to both new weekly episodes plus a couple of the back catalog in an effort to catch up with all the ones I had missed. But my listening of this particular podcast has dropped off considerably because of my decreasing interest in true crime. Another one, though, that I'm still enjoying is Someone Knows Something. I'm currently working through season 6 as they release episodes, and the host, David Ridgen, is really what makes this particular podcast. Unfortunately, they do cover cold cases, so you rarely get to experience a satisfying conclusion with these ones, which is kind of frustrating. And a couple of the seasons have certainly been better than others, but Someone Knows Something is one where they can really dive in depth and spend an entire season looking into a particular case and trying to dig up new information or whatever it is they happen to find there. My number 7 category is music and creativity. In this one, I have a podcast called 27 Club, and they just finished the first season, and it was all about Jimi Hendrix. Their next season is going to be about Jim Morrison, and I guess they're going to devote each season to a musical artist who died at the age of 27. The host also does another podcast called Disgraceland, which is quite good, which is just one-off episodes of various musical topics. And he has a style and a tone that is really unique and interesting with his podcasts. The other one in this category is one that's totally fallen off the map, unfortunately, and it's called Creators Cast. It was one where the host would interview a different creator each week. So maybe it was a writer or a game designer or an artist of some sort, but he would dive into whatever art form that creator was involved with and talk about their creative process and really the nuts and bolts of getting things created and put out into the public. So it was one that I really enjoyed a lot, and unfortunately it seems to be a dead podcast now, but all the episodes from that have been released are certainly worth diving into if you're a creative person, and especially if you have an interest in trying to get your creativity or your artwork out to the public and made widely available. Number 6 is my history category. I do enjoy history, and the first one here is Dan Carlin's Hardcore History Addendum. Dan Carlin is a crazy amateur historian who releases podcasts that are hours long. Well, at least in his kind of original Hardcore History podcast, he would release episodes hours long on a particular topic, and maybe a topic would be explored over several hours long podcasts, so that he'd maybe put a dozen hours into discussing the First World War maybe. And in any case, he would get to dive into a lot of depth and a lot of detail, and it made it really interesting. But the time commitment was a bit much, and which is why I have chosen his Hardcore History Addendum to put on the list, because that's one where he chooses to, in a more brief fashion, dive into particular historical issues and not necessarily spend 3 or 4 hours an episode working through the topic. Another one I enjoy a lot is called You're Dead to Me, which is one that has a rather funny host and always has weekly guest hosts, and they just look into the life of a historical person along with the guests, who are typically funny and interesting people as well. Similarly, there's one called Evil Genius, where the host, again another funny guy, often with comedian guest hosts, takes a historical person and looks at the great things they did and the terrible things they did, and along with their guests tries to determine whether the person was evil or a genius. It really brings out the fact that even some of the most lauded people in history were involved with some pretty horrible things, and in that regard, it's a little bit of a depressing thing, learning the dark secrets behind some of the heroes of history. But on the other hand, people who are typically labeled as villains have done some really good things too. So it brings out that nuance of humanity that people are so terrible at because people love black and white and simplicity, and they don't necessarily like nuance. But this one really brings out the nuance of historical personages. The last one in the history category is the History Chicks, who are two ladies who just, again, pick a topic from history and together they discuss it. What's fun about it is they don't talk to each other ahead of time about what specific things they're going to say, so that it's as if they're having a conversation with each other about the topic, and that's kind of what makes this one particularly interesting. The number 5 category is probably going to be the least surprising category for anyone who watches my channel, although it might be surprising that it's as low as number 5 and not higher, but this is my board games category. I have 4 podcasts here. The first one I'll mention is Rahdo Talks Through. This is Richard Ham's podcast, a longtime board game video creator, but he has a very thorough and sometimes extremely long podcast, up to a few hours at a time, but I enjoy it and I do listen through the entire thing. Part of the reason it's so long is because he's devoted to answering every single question that anybody asks of him. So he has a lot of dedication to his fan base and to his viewership. Next up is Ding and Dent, hosted by Charlie and Raph, one of my favorite podcasts to listen to in the board game sphere. And they both happen to be very talented writers and content creators in the wider board game arena, but their Ding and Dent podcast is one that I enjoy listening to. Then we have Drive Through FM, again from a long-time board game video creator, Joel Eddy. He's somebody that I enjoy listening to, whether it's in video format or his Drive Through FM podcast format. And finally, there's Shut Up and Sit Down, once again, a team that started off with making videos, and they still make really excellent, some of the best board game videos out there. So I guess of all my board game podcasts, the only one that didn't start off making videos is Ding and Dent. And if you watched my favorite YouTube channels, you'll have recognized some of these people. Number 4 is a category that is appropriate, seeing as I just watched a rocket launch live, and that is science and medicine. My favorite one in this category is The Infinite Monkey Cage, a British show in which they always have a few science-related guests, and it's hosted by a physicist and a comedian, and is always highly entertaining to listen to. It's always very funny as well as informative. Next up is Sean Carroll's Mindscape, hosted by Sean Carroll, another physicist. This is an interesting one because a lot of the times he really dives into some really deep and complicated science stuff, while at other times he might have even a pop singer on to talk about various issues. So it's an interesting mix of very in-depth science and just more fun, lighthearted topics. But he definitely leans much more to the hard science end of things. The next one is called Science Versus, and it takes a look at a particular science topic, and with each episode, we'll hit 3 main points on whatever topic they're looking at. So it's not a long enough podcast to dive really in depth to the topic, but they do cover some interesting things. And then finally, in the more medicine side of things, is Sawbones, a marital tour of misguided medicine, which is hosted by a physician and her comedian husband, who happens to be Justin McElroy, one of the McElroy brothers, who is involved with some other pretty funny podcasts. But they typically cover historical medical topics, although lately they've also been doing much more up-to-date and relevant things related to the COVID pandemic. Up to category 3 now, which is my human interest category, and here I have Revisionist History. had to pause for a minute and go, wait, that isn't in my top 2, that's only my number 3. But it shows you how good my top 2 are going to be, because Revisionist History is hosted by Malcolm Gladwell, a fairly well-known author and speaker, and his approach to various issues is a very narrative, storytelling, and fascinating approach. It's hard to describe, but if you check out some Revisionist History episodes, I think across the board you'll find them to be pretty interesting in the way he approaches his topics. And then one that I'm relatively new to is the Happiness Lab, which looks at the science of happiness, which is kind of an interesting topic in and of itself, although I haven't listened to a lot of the episodes yet. So far I've been enjoying it quite a lot. Category 2 are my serials, not breakfast cereals, but serial as in a continuing story over time. And my favorite one in this category is called S-Town, where they cover this one particular story over several episodes. And as the story unfolds, it's just such a mind-blowing thing. It's I don't want to say anything because I don't want to spoil anything, but each layer that's peeled back of the story is kind of more mind-blowing than the next. Similarly, I think the same group of people did my other one in this category, which is called Serial, S-E-R-I-A-L, and it's a similar deal where they look at a very interesting story and reveal it over the course of several episodes, and these stories they cover are just pretty fascinating. And finally, my number 1, the best of the best. And like I said, I saved just a single podcast to put into my number 1 category, and it is The Dollop. The Dollop is an American history podcast where one host, Dave Anthony, will tell a story from history to his co-host, Gareth Reynolds, who hasn't heard the story before. So like the listeners, Gareth Reynolds is hearing the story for the first time, and he's the funniest guy. So even though so many of these historical stories are so awful, the history of humanity is nothing if not horrifying. But they do manage to turn it into just a very laugh-out-loud, funny experience for the listener. They've been at it a long time, and they have hundreds of episodes, so I have not been getting at all tired of them so far. And pandemic or no pandemic, I will definitely listen to every single episode that they release. So these are my top 25 podcasts out of literally a couple of hundred that I had to narrow it down to. That's how many podcasts I've been listening to over the past couple of years. But maybe you know of a podcast that I don't know of that I should be listening to. Please let me know. What are your favorite podcasts? I'm always interested in finding new and interesting podcasts to listen to, so please do let me know in the comments below. I want to thank Joanna, my Patreon supporter, for helping me out with my YouTube channel here. I want to encourage other people to check out my Patreon, and I want to thank you for watching my video. Hey, it's Josh. Thank you so much for watching. If you could caress that subscribe button, if you could reach out and touch that like button, if you could share the love of this video with someone who you think would enjoy it, I would really appreciate that. Cheers. A few weeks ago, I made a video about my favorite YouTube channels, thinking that during this pandemic time when everyone's stuck at home, it might be a helpful video for people who might be interested in looking at the... Okay. So I'm not spending a lot of time and had to sort of give up on the... You rarely have the satisfaction of having a satisfying the time commitment up to category number 3 right now. Up to category number 3 night. Carroll, who is... I want to thank Joanna, my Patreon patient.